So good morning everybody, it's lovely to have you here again, and what we're going to do today is the last of the 8 tutorials, and I deliberately left just the articles for us to cover today because I don't want you to have too much to study after I've done this. So after this tutorial, all you really need to do is catch up with any work that you might be behind on and then go through the articles. Now these are articles that have been recommended by various executives on SACNA. And you'll see some of them are very old articles. I don't know if any of you have already read the articles. Some of them are very, very old. Some of them are a little bit newer. But what I've done is I've just taken out the essence of each of them, because some of them, you'll look at them and you'll think, but this isn't relevant at all to what we're doing now. But if you read through it carefully, you see there are certain elements that are very much still relevant to what we're doing now. So I've taken those out and just highlighted them. Okay. So the first one that we're going to talk about is, I love the name of this article, it's called Brain Damage Caused by Collision with Forensic Neuropsychologists. And it's written by Russell Bauer. And what I also want to say about these, what I'm going to go through with you today, I'm going to go through article by article, but you'll see that there might be a little bit of repetition because some of the articles, they repeat what somebody else has maybe said. And it's going to seem very bitty, you know, a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of that. It's just because of the nature of my just extracting bits out of the articles, right? So it's not going to flow. So the first point that is made is that patients who are falsely labeled as impaired are sometimes done a potentially serious disservice by their neuropsychologists because such labels often engender self-fulfilling prophecies. So we need to be very sure that somebody is impaired before we say that they are. Because if they're not, and they're saying they're impaired, they might live out their lives in such a way that they actually almost become impaired, or their behavior looks like they are actually impaired. Again, this whole thing is about bias. Some practicing forensic neuropsychologists appear to succumb to economic forces and develop rigid reputations as plaintiff-friendly or defense-friendly. Neuropsychologists who tend to find impairments and who tend to diagnose brain damage encourage, either implicitly or explicitly, referrals from plaintiff attorneys. This has a potential of causing a vicious cycle where you find a disability, get more referrals. So in other words, what we must be very careful of, and I can't stress this enough, there's a lot of complaints about psychologists, particularly neuropsychologists, by attorneys, by advocates, by other professions, that we tend to find disability where there isn't a disability. And the reason we do that sometimes is because we get pressure on us by attorneys who want us to find something wrong. I actually recently had an attorney who said he wants to refer me a patient, and we had to discuss sort of payment terms and so on, and then he said to me, before he sends me the patient, can I guarantee I will find something wrong with the patient? Okay. So you get that. And the attorneys, of course the attorneys want us to find something wrong because then they've got a case. But we have to always remember that we are trying to find the truth of the matter. And if we get a reputation of finding fault where there isn't fault, we are criticized in court, we lose our reputations, and people won't refer to us anymore. Okay. But what often happens in practice is that the attorneys, if they know that you keep finding a disability, they'll keep referring to you. So it's more work, more money, and this is what tends to keep the cycle going until you're found out. Okay. And this remind me what the phone's off. All right. Now I'm going to list a number of common errors that neuropsychologists make. Neuropsychological tests are tests of brain damage. But that does not mean that if a person scored poorly on a neuropsychological test, he or she necessarily has brain damage. There might be another reason why they do badly on a test. Neuropsychological complaints are not necessarily valid indicators of real-life neuropsychological deficit. So if a patient says, I have memory problems, doesn't mean that he necessarily has memory problems that is going to show up when tested objectively. The ecological validity of most neuropsychological test procedures is not known, and what that means is that just because you're finding a problem when you're testing a person doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to have that problem in real life. If you look in LESAC and Spreen and Strauss and so on, if they have an ecological validity test done on a certain test, or ecological validity studies, it will be reported there. But a lot of our tests haven't had those. So just be aware, just because a person's doing badly on a test doesn't mean that they necessarily do badly in real life. Also, 2 deficits are not necessarily worse than 1. Okay? You could have 1 deficit, but it's in an area that is really, really important, compared to maybe 2 deficits that are in areas that are not as important. All functions cannot be expected to be normal or above average in the intact individual. So you might have somebody who's perfectly healthy, perfectly normal, never had any brain injury, never had any developmental problems, but still score below your average. It is possible for neuropsychological results to reveal effects of subtle brain injuries not seen on neurological examination. Okay, we know that on neurological, our MRI scans and so on, although they're becoming more and more sensitive, they don't always pick up on neuropsychological damage. However, that does not mean that in the absence of neuroradiologic confirmation, the neuropsychological test predictions are necessarily right. So let's say you have some scans and they say you don't find any abnormality. Your tests say you find abnormality. You can argue that your tests are more sensitive and that's why it's not picked up here, but be careful. You're not necessarily right. Okay. All neuropsychological data is subject to interpretation by the professional. What one sees as normal may be seen as abnormal by a more discerning neuropsychologist. What is often at the crux of differences in interpretation is that different standards of interpretation or different impairment cutoffs are being applied. And this is where you get neuropsychologists that have different opinions, having tested the same person. Fighting in court, the one says, no, I don't see a problem, the other one finds a problem. It depends on which cutoffs they've used and so on. So you need to be very clear that in your opinion, you've taken everything into consideration, that you have a reasonable opinion. I just want to go back to the point. I think that is also why more and more we are asked to do joint minutes with other neuropsychologists. So we can sit, compare notes, see, yes, we agree with this, maybe not that for this reason, and then one joint minute goes to the court, and at least they don't have to try and figure out why we differ. They've got one joint minute. Neuropsychological tests cannot be applied in all settings and will not work equally well in all situations. And of course in South Africa we know this. We know this because you can't just go to a very cut-off rural area and expect that the test results you find there would be valid. Okay. Patient complaints obtained through self-report are not important and reliable sources of information about the nature of cognitive deficits because they can be subject to a host of distortions. So in other words, when you have to take the history is very important to the person. But if the person is saying, I have memory difficulties, I can't concentrate, I don't sleep well, remember, and this may be a very obvious thing to say, but remember those are subjective. And the person coming to you is probably coming to you because he's hoping to get some sort of compensation for cognitive difficulties. So he's likely to, he could be exaggerating his symptoms. And also we all are subject. So if we have aches and pains, let's say I've got a headache. My experience of a headache may be very different to your experience of a headache. So if somebody says I have a terrible headache 3 times a week, their terrible might not be exactly the same as somebody else's terrible. So you've got to take it, it's important information, but don't count on it. Neuropsychological data and the patient interview is not sufficient in itself in inferring past health, cognitive performance, and psychological or psychiatric history. So if you have, let's say you're testing a child and the mother says to you, my child always did so well at school, and I had this injury and he now no longer does. Now that mother's perception of how well her child did is again very subjective. So get school reports. I've over and over and over found that once I see the school reports, I think, it's actually quite a mediocre little child. Not nearly as brilliantly as his mother thought he was. And the same with health and psychological and psychiatric history. the collateral information is important, but you can't rely on it. You cannot tell what a test measures by looking at its name. I quite like that. I think I know when I started studying neuropsychology, and I'd come across these tests like logical memory. I think, so what is logical about? Is it testing logic? Okay, I can see it's testing memory, but where does the logical come in? So don't be thrown or misguided by the names of tests. You need to find out what is the construct that the test is testing. Every test does not have its own special location in the brain. That is also, I must admit, when I started neuropsychology, I was very naive to think, well, if you do this test and they do bad in it, then it means that area of the brain has been affected. And there are very, very few tests that are that specific. So bear that in mind. Beware of confirmatory bias, the tendency to seek information to support your hypothesis and ignore contradicting evidence. Neuropsychology is difficult. And as you go along, as you're collecting the history and you've gone through the medical notes and you're busy testing the patient, you form a hypothesis. But we must be careful not to cling too much to that hypothesis, that we interpret everything that supports the hypothesis and we ignore the things that don't. Okay, we need to bear in mind that some things are going to be against what we think is going on, and we need to try and find out why that is the case. A single dramatic finding that contradicts other findings cannot be overinterpreted. So let's say generally this person is doing average on just about everything, maybe low average on some things, high average on some things, but you've got this general average picture, but they do very badly on one test. Be careful of overinterpreting that result. Look at it, because maybe there's a very good reason why the person did badly, and see if it links into the nature of the head injury, the area of the lesion. But it might just be that at that moment, the person, there was a car that drove past and they were distracted because it was a very important fancy car and they were distracted. Or just at that moment, they were starting to get hungry and they were distracted by a sort of rumbling stomach. Okay. Regard signs that can occur with more than one condition as suggestive and not an indicator of a condition. So they're tentative. Okay? When you have a number of things that all point in the same direction, you can be more certain. But we can never be absolutely sure about our findings. We know if we are probably right or possibly right, but we can never be 100% sure. False negatives, absence of low scores, can occur with a brain-injured person who has not been assessed properly. So just because there isn't any low scores doesn't mean that the person doesn't have an injury. You might have just missed it. You might have not given the right tests. Okay. Now, this article, psychological assessment versus psychological testing, is one of the ones that are really old. When I send you these slides, I'll send you all these articles again as well. You should have all received them from Tanya, but in case you haven't, I'll send them all to you again. Now, Matsuratsu distinguishes between psychological testing versus psychological assessment, and he says psychological testing is an activity that has little or no continuing relationship or legally defined responsibility between examinee and examiner. Psychological assessment, however, is engaged in by a clinician and a patient in a one-to-one relationship and has statutorily defined or implied professional responsibilities, like if we're doing medical legal work. It's an ongoing relationship. Increasingly, psychologist clinicians are being engaged in debate in court regarding the validity of our clinical opinions, including opinions based on our most respected instruments for psychological assessment. Now, when this article was written, it was at a time where you could just say, I've used the Vishta, whatever, this is what it said, this is my opinion. But it doesn't work that way anymore. Now you need to be able to say why that test was a valid and reliable test to use, and why you can rely on the results that you got. You need to be able to explain that in court. What I also want us to say with that is, you don't have to, in your mind, remember all the validity and reliability statistics and so on. But if you do go to court, it would be a good idea if you can take your test manuals with you. So that if there is a question, you can say, would you please give me 10 minutes? I just need to look it up in my manuals and I can answer your question. Okay. Also means that when you choose a test, if you're going to buy a test that you feel comfortable with. Okay. Be careful of assuming that the highest scores on a Vöchler IQ test is an indication of premorbid ability. Again, this is written in a time where people thought if you do a number of tests, you do the Vöchler test, and the highest score, scale score on the subtest, there was this assumption that that is an indicator of the person's premorbid ability before they had the accident. And he's saying don't fall into that trap. Be careful not to assume that low scores on tests are due to brain damage if the person being tested has a low level of education, has a history of poor performance, example at school, has a history of alcohol or drug use. I'll put in the drug use because I think when the article was written, drugs wasn't really a problem. It's a very old article. Has not had his or her age taken into account. And I've also just added here, in South Africa, we can also add language barrier issues and poor quality of education. Now, standard error of measurement. How many of us actually go and look at the standard errors of measurement of the tests that we use? I thought I'd add in this little calculation at the bottom here in case you ever want to go and work out the standard error of measurement of your tests. Okay. Now, test scores are not exact. There's room for error. And that is why the standard error of measurement is really important. There's a range. So let's say a person has, okay, I'm going to get to that now. Let me first read this. A good method of taking into account the standard error of measurement is for the practitioner to consider a band of scores extending 2 standard errors above and 2 below the obtained score. So if the score is 9, let's say you've done the scale, there's a Vöchler test, and you've done a subtest, and the scale score is 9. But the standard error of measurement is 1. Then the patient's true score can be between 8 and 10. If the score is 9, but the standard error is 1.5, then the patient's true score can be between 7.5 and 10.5. So be careful of being too, saying this person definitely scored this. You don't actually know that. There's an error of measurement. You know it's more or less in that range.
What events in the report?
That is why when I put in a report, I don't in my index I'll say what the exact measures were, the standard, the score, and then I put in the Z scores. And then in the body of the test, you just indicate the category, like high average, average, superior, borderline, because those categories are vague enough to take into account things like standard errors of measurement. This is also why if you have, let's say, 2 children, one has an IQ of 102 and one has an IQ of 100, then one with 102 is not more bright than the one with 100 because of standard error of measurement. Okay. All right. Now looking at retest reliability. When interpreting the Ways R, okay, now I'm saying this probably applies to the Ways 3 and the Ways 4 too, that's this old article. When interpreting the Ways score of an individual who is examined only once, a practitioner cannot assume that such a score exactly represents the true magnitude of the associated attribute being measured. Okay. So there's a retest validity. So it has been found that if you test a group of people, and you test them again with the same test, but you wait long enough so that there isn't a practice effect, they're going to get slightly different scores. Again, it has to do with their concentration on that day, how distracted they are, and so on. Of course, we can't test people and then test them again later, but we just need to bear in mind that our scores are not completely accurate. Okay, there's an error of measurement. If you had to test them again, it might be slightly different. And that is also useful to look at the retest reliabilities of the tests that you are using, so that if you're in court, you can say, look, there's a reasonable retest reliability. So if I tested him once, chances are he would perform this way if I had to test him again. Okay. Test scatter. By test scatter, I mean this article has a lot to do with the Vöchler test. So let's say I test a person, and he has a scale score of 9 in the one, and 6 in the one, and 14 in the other, and 2 in the other. Okay, that's maybe a bit extreme. Let's say, but where there's some scatter. Okay, test scatter is normal. Normal people have test scatter. And there was a time where we were taught that if there's test scatter, then it's significant. And it's probably not. Now, Matarazzo just, I think with, when you read through his article, you think, oh, I keep doing everything wrong, I don't ever want to go stand in court, I don't want to have to defend his tests, and my opinion based on the test. But this is what he also says. My experience in the courtroom has persuaded me that when an assessment is done well, it is patently obvious to all involved, that is, juries, judges, and the attorneys for both the plaintiff and defense. That what such a psychologist expert witness concluded was valid, true, within the reasonable degree of certainty required in such litigation. So if you've done your assessment properly, it will be patently clear to everybody, and they're not going to fight with you in court. Okay. Now let's look at the article. Interpretation and misinterpretation of the South African Wechsler-Bellevue Adult Intelligence Scale. Now, the Wechsler-Bellevue, I think, came out before, just very, very long ago. So, as I said, these are really old tests, old articles. But the one point is, one of the worst shortcomings of the Wechsler type tests, and this still applies, is that they're blind to the adaptive syndrome produced by frontal injuries. The Wechsler tests don't test for executive function. Okay, so we need to bear that in mind. What matters is not only what injury the brain sustained, but also what kind of brain sustained the injury. You need to look at premorbid abilities. Okay. Be careful of assuming a person sustained a brain injury if there is a significant difference between verbal IQ and PIQ. That was also somebody told me that people have been taught that if there's a significant difference between verbal IQ and performance IQ, that there's necessarily a brain injury. Be careful of that. If the VIQ is elevated, it might just be because of old learning, because old learning elevates the VIQ scores after brain injury, which can result in the differences. So look at the level of education of the person. The more well-educated they are, the more likely their verbal IQ is going to be raised. And a Wechsler type IQ test is not enough for a neuropsychological evaluation. I think we all know that. The following also needs to be assessed: motor ability, reading, writing words and numbers to diction, that's where you read to somebody and they write it down, geometric design and reproduction, like the very complex figure, and memory, including narrative memory, list learning, immediate and delayed recall, and visual memory. There's another article, this is a newer article called Gnomes with Knowing by Kevin Walsh. And what he says is it's important to understand neuroanatomy and arterial distribution. That's why we learn neuroanatomy, and we learn about where the veins and the arteries go and so on. The understanding and ability to identify neuropathology is important. It's a mistake to take summarized scores of a brain-injured person to mean the same as a person who is neurologically intact. So, when he talks about summarized scores, he talks about like IQ scores, or like verbal IQ, performance IQ, where it's a summary of a number of subscores. While it might mean in a normally intact person that they have a certain IQ, the same would not apply for somebody who's had a brain injury. Okay? Because they might have certain, let's say, slow processing speed as a result of the injury, which makes all of the time tests much lower, and then it looks like their IQ is low, which is not necessarily the case. Do not rely on a person's test scores alone. I'm sure we all know that, understand that. And the person's history is very important. Also to bear in mind, there may be several reasons for failing a test. It might be, let's say it's a written test, the person might suddenly be getting a cramp in their hand, or maybe due to an injury they have pain in their hand anyway, could lead them to do very badly. So don't assume that it's a cognitive reason if maybe there's a motor reason, for example. Each test measures additional aspects to what it is meant to measure. And this is really just saying more the same. Example, motor ability or visual acuity. Let's say the person can't see very well. You're asking them to do the trail making test. Or even that they have a stiff neck, so they can't move around easily to look for the numbers. you need to take these things into account. It might not be that they have difficulty with single mental or dual mental tracking. If two people do badly on the same test, it does not mean that they did badly for the same reason. I'm sure we understand that. A small lesion might have significant impact, and a large lesion might have an insignificant impact. And what you test depends on what you know. That is why it is so important. I find a lot of psychologists in our country, they do neuropsychology, but they've only ever done one type of neuropsychology. Let's say they've only worked with children with learning disorders. So suddenly when there's a child with autism, they don't have the knowledge of it. And, or let's say you're a psychologist, you've only ever done traumatic brain injury. Now suddenly you have a stroke patient. You tend to find the things that you know about. And that is why it's so important that you learn about all the neuropathologies. In children and adults, you must understand all of them, so you don't fall into that trap of only finding what you know. Okay, and then the 4 fatal flaws of brain injury assessment in a cross-cultural context. This is a very recent article by Anne Edwards. And she makes these 4 points, but I've written her points and I've just written it in my own language because I sometimes, she writes extremely well, but sometimes one has to almost decipher what she's writing. So the first point is failure to recognize within race group heterogeneity on cognitive test performance in association with factors such as quality of education. Okay, so that's the first fatal flaw. What she's really saying is, don't assume that most people within a race group should score the same on tests. Okay, so let's say you are a Xhosa person. Don't assume that just because you're a Xhosa person, you're going to score the same if you're like an urban, living in a city, and grew up in a city compared to in an urban area, you know, different levels of education, different quality of education, and so on. Lack of rigorous attention being paid to the exact mode of test administration used in a derived normative base to be used for assessment purposes only. So in other words, choose the correct norms in accordance with how the test was administered. So before you choose the norms, make sure that the way the norms are done is the same method that you used when you did the test. That also means that when you're preparing to do an assessment, you need to know how to administer the test depending on the norms that you have. Okay, and I think I've mentioned this before, but if you take, for example, the Ray complex figure. Now, you get norms on, there are different ways to do it. The one way, okay, you give it for a person to copy, and then you take it away and you immediately ask them to draw it again, and then you do it after a delay. That's one way of doing it, and there are norms for that method. There are other ways to do it. You copy it, you take it away, and half an hour later you do the delayed recall. Now, there are different norms that have to do with that way of administering the test. And you need to be sure before you even do the test which norms you're going to use so that you administer the test appropriately. Estimating an expected level of performance for an individual on diverse cognitive tests based on an IQ score. So in other words, you cannot assume pre-morbid ability based on the abilities of the group of people from which the person shares a cultural background. So let's say again, it's a certain group of people. You can't assume, and now you're testing somebody from that cultural group who's had a brain injury. You can't look at that cultural group and assume that this person's pre-morbid ability was the same as the group's. Okay, you have to find out what was that person's pre-morbid ability. Adopting a thoroughly rule-bound actuarial approach to test interpretation over a contextually based clinical approach. In other words, do not rely on test results alone. Okay, keep saying that over and over. And be careful of those error measurements and so on. Don't say, no, this person definitely scored in this percentile. Be careful of that because it might be a little bit more, might be a little bit less. And you need to take into account the clinical picture. What do the medical notes say? What are the complaints? What are the complaints of the person? What are the complaints of the people living with him? What do the MRI scans say? Okay. If the interpretation does not make sense contextually, or if there are inexplicable contradictions within the test profile, then something is probably wrong with the use of the statistics. Okay. Now, another article is called Towards a Comprehensive Model of Neuropsychological Rehabilitation. It's the last article I'm going to be talking about today, so hopefully we'll have a bit of time for discussion as well. I find in South Africa we really are lacking rehabilitation neuropsychologists, people that can actually go there and help people to live their lives as meaningfully as possible after some sort of neurological difficulty. But Barbara Wilson is quite a well-known rehabilitation neuropsychologist from the States. And Sackler has decided to put in she wrote a chapter for a book, which is a nice, well-rounded kind of summary of some of the issues in neurorehabilitation. And so they've asked everybody just to read through this and prepare this too. But the essence of that article is that when you're doing rehabilitation with people, you need to try to determine the person's pre-morbid lifestyle. Let's say a person's had a stroke. You might have two people who've had a stroke. One might have had a very active sports life before the stroke. Another person might have had a very active musical life. Let's say they played an instrument before the stroke. Now, you can't do rehabilitation with the two of them in the same way. The one who had a very active sport life probably really loves sport and would want to be involved in sport. You can get them involved in coaching, or even if it's just watching sport. The person who has a musical background is probably not going to appreciate being asked to coach children in sport. Okay, so they would maybe want to go attend concerts or continue to play an instrument to the extent that they can, or at least just sit and listen to music. So you need to understand what is the pre-morbid function, what are the pre-morbid activities of the person before you design a rehabilitation program. And you need to identify the nature and extent of brain injury, and if there will be a recovery. Sorry, there's a mistake there. So in other words, we all know that after a brain injury there's usually a period of spontaneous recovery. So if you're working in a hospital setting like this, you're often working with people who are still in the process of recovery, and you're going to be helping them along in that process. This is where physiotherapy is very important, occupational therapy is very important. But if a person's already reached a time in their lives, or a period where there's unlikely to be further improvement in their medical condition, then your rehabilitation is going to be slightly different. You can maybe cut back on the occupational therapy and speech therapy to a large extent, speech therapy as well, and physiotherapy to a large extent, and maybe focus more on how to make this person comfortable and content and happy within their context and where they are. And of course, their families are very important, because often people are at home, the families are looking after them, so the families need support. They need to know how to deal with this person. They need emotional support as well. Because the happier the family is, the happier the person with the injury is as well. You need to identify current problems, and sometimes it can be small things, like I can't get up the stairs. Okay, well then you just arrange that there's a ramp put up the stairs, let's say at the house. Or I can't reach the towel when I'm bathing. Well then just see if you can put it lower. There's certain little things that one can do, but you need to hear what the current difficulties are and see what you can do about it. Often that is not our role, I must also add here. Often that is more the role of the occupational therapist, but still, we need to understand what the current problems are for that person. And we need to negotiate suitable goals. It doesn't help you say to a person who's just had a very bad injury, we want to get you back to university. Okay, that person might never be able to go back to university. You can't give them unrealistic goals. So, but it's also good to hear what sort of goals they have. What would they like to achieve? What would they like to achieve in the next 6 months and the next year and so on, and negotiate that with them. Sometimes their impairments can be improved. Sometimes there are things to do with activities and their social lives that can be improved. And then after your rehabilitation program, let's say after a set period, you evaluate, have we managed to achieve these goals? What went wrong? What could we have done better? And then set new goals for the next period of time. Is there anybody here that does rehabilitation? Okay, excellent. And this is your required reading. these are the articles, but as I said to you, I'm going to send you the articles as well. And what I also want you to do, I think I mentioned this right in the beginning, or you might have noticed it yourself, but I've left out the chapter in Lezak that deals with the geography of the brain. Now, why I left it out in your reading so far is because she doesn't have an easy way of conveying anatomy and physiology. So, but hopefully you're mostly up to date with all the other things, and after today's brain dissection and so on, you're going to feel more confident with it. And so when you go and read your anatomy chapter now, it's going to make more sense to you than if you started with it. I think if you had to read it first, you would have run out screaming and decided you don't want to do this at all. So it's a bit easier to understand.